afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to today's inset for the Global Change series from Share Africa for the Botswana International University of Science and Technology specifically, but we welcome everybody that's here today. Now to start off, I'm going to just start with some visuals. Let's just go there. Let's look at a broader perspective, like if we look through a telescope at the night sky, and this is what we see. Because forming part of our solar system and in the Milky Way, that is where we are, on planet Earth. Now, while trace amounts of water vapor has been detected on other planets such as Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, planet Earth is the only planet known or currently known to have life. And in this Global Change series, we've spoken about fresh water with river pollution by Dr. Patrick Sotomo, and that was river pollution in the Free State Province with a case study from the Kwakwa region. We've also spoken about salt water or the ocean, and that was the fisheries management with a case study on the stock structure of kingklip, Chinopteris capensis. Today, we're going inland, and we're going to look at the effect of climate change on the Okavango ecosystem. That is the delta found on the western part of Africa. Now, as scientists, we have to answer the questions who, what, where, when, why, and how. And when we answer this, we have to do some data analysis and interpret this. And our esteemed guest today, Dr. Wolski, has worked for a number of years at the Okavango Research Institute, part of the University of Botswana. He's a researcher with the Climate Systems Analysis Group, or CSAG, since 2012. He describes himself as a hydroclimatologist who reveled in the challenges associated with translating climate data into useful information. He has worked on various aspects of visualization and presentation of the climate data, and has gained extensive experience over the last decade in using the outcome climate models in hydrological analysis that contributes to climate change impact assessment and seasonal forecasting. And with that, I give over to you, Dr. Wolski. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Good afternoon, everyone. Aisha introduced me pretty well. So without further ado, I'll just share the screen and off we go with the presentation, with the lecture. So as Aisha mentioned, I currently work at the University of Cape Town at the Climate System Analysis Group. I worked at the Okavango Research Institute for 12 years. And while there, I've worked quite a lot on hydrology and sort of hydroecology of the system. And one of the elements that we've looked at was climate change. So essentially what I'll be presenting today is sort of result of the work that was carried out long time ago by me and my colleagues in the Okavango. And Richard, Dr. Mazavedi, was part of the team. We've worked together at a project, one of the projects that looked at some aspects of the climate change impacts on the Okavango. And yeah, so it's very nice, very pleasant for me to connect to Richard through this forum and to contribute to Richard to your teaching at BIRST. So very quickly, what this talk is about. So I'm a hydrologist, climatologist. I'm not really an ecologist. So I can't really talk about in depth about ecological impacts of climate change on the Okavango Delta. I will touch on this in a way. So but I think you know how I build that talk, that presentation, is that you know, to understand the complexity of the impacts on the system of climate change, impacts of climate change on that system, one has to understand the complexity of hydroecological system of the Okavango. And that's what I wanted to quickly introduce and highlight a couple of elements that are important to from the perspective of appreciating of how the system works and how does climate change, how does it influence that system. So that's basically the outline. Very quickly, I think you perhaps should be familiar with the Okavango Delta, and I will be talking about Okavango Delta rather than about the Okavango, the broader Okavango system. And well, you know, if we were to sort of talk really about the Okavango to any depth, one would need a good couple of hours of lectures to understand its hydrology, to understand its ecological functioning, the whole sort of wealth of ecosystem that includes you know, all the charismatic animals that attract all the tourists to that system, and all the people who live in that system using the resources that it provides. But you know, unfortunately, that's not the place, no time to do that. So I will just highlight, as I mentioned, some of the aspects that are important for its hydrology. So you know, the Okavango Delta, I mean, Okavango is, we know it as a wetland. It's essentially a patch, a wet patch in the relatively dry or almost arid surrounding, located in the middle of the Southern African continent. And that wetland is, geologically speaking, is, you know, we talk about it as a delta. It's not formally a delta. It's an alluvial fan that is inundated by waters that come from somewhere else, not necessarily by very local rainfall. And the alluvial fan is built here. We can see it in the sort of tectonic setting. So there is a part of the crust that subsides, and that river comes in and deposits sediment and builds that alluvial cone, and this is what forms that wetland. And why it is formed there is because the river that comes to that wetland, it is sourced from central Angola, and from the region that is basically characterized by much like a 3 times as large rainfall as the rainfall in the Okavango itself. You know, here we have around 400-500 millimeters of rainfall a year. In the upper Angola, I mean the upper catchment here in Angola, we have roughly 1,000, in excess of 1,000 millimeters a year. So there is lots of surplus of water here, and it comes down with the river and feeds the wetland. What is important there in how that water feeds that wetland is something that is called flood pulse. So the water doesn't sort of seep constantly. It comes in a one large annual flood, and what is amazing there really is the timing of that flood. So you know, I illustrate here in 2 satellite images the delta in low flood. So the black color here, if you are not familiar with satellite images, the black color here is water. All the other colors are not water. So basically here we have a relatively small extent of inundation in the delta, and in a couple of months later, the inundation spreads to a much larger area there. So that's our flood pulse. And what is important there is that the flood pulse is, as we call it, asynchronous with the rainy season. So you know, that figure shows us rainfall across the year. So we have a rainy season between November and March roughly. But the flood wave, when it comes from Angola, it peaks at the inlet here in the upper part of the delta. It peaks in April and slowly propagates and through the system. So the delta is inundated with the largest extent only in sort of September, August, September, sometimes October. So very late in the season, just before the next year's rains are there. So now, if you consider the context, the fact that it is based, that wetlands is located in the basically in a semi-arid area of Kalahari, and we have this huge amount of water that rolls through the landscape and occurs there in the season that normally, outside of it, there is no water at all. Everything dries. Everything is basically, there's no other surface water sources. And here we have a large, very large, 12,000 square kilometers wetland located in this arid landscape. You can imagine what it does to a regional ecology, in a way, to the life of birds, to the life of migrating mammals. That's a very important sort of role that this wetland plays. So I'm not sure whether you see the animation here. So I was showing, how that flood spreads from sort of annual low to annual high in a couple of months. But what is happening in the delta is that, that those variations are not regular. So we have this sort of year-to-year variability. There are very dry years or sequences of dry years and very wet years. So that pulsing takes place not just at the seasonal time scale, not just from February to October. It takes place from the year to year. So some years the floods are large, some years the floods are small, and that's the sort of pulsating life of the delta. And the result of that at the end is the presence of a number of we call them hydroecological zones or regions or ecotopes or hydrotopes. There are different names in literature, but basically, we have the situation where some central part of that system is basically permanently inundated. All year around it is underwater. Then we have an outer fringe of that receives water regularly. So every year it basically receives water during a flood season, and then the water recedes from that zone. And every year that process happens on and off and on and off. And then on the outer fringes, we have floodplains that are inundated, that receive water only in the high flood years, or higher flood years, wetter years. And that's a sort of outer fringe. And outside of that, we would have our normal, typical Kalahari type of a savanna. And just to bring you closer to how it looks on the ground, these are a couple of photos that show permanent swamp. So we have papyrus, fields of papyrus that you can see here from the channel, and some sort of other channel filling grasses. The seasonal floodplains look slightly different. So we have that there's tree-covered islands and grass or sedge-covered floodplains that flip basically from the landscape on the left, which is in full flood, to the landscape on the right, which is in a drier period. So this is that seasonal floodplains, occasional floodplains. That's sort of a functional classification, but one can look at more sort of ecologically oriented classification that could talk about your typical savanna landscape. These are the regions that are basically not flooded by the floodwaters. Then we have a grassland that is dominated by grasses that is occasionally flooded. So once in a time only, and we'll have basically rain-fed grasses or grasses that grow when there is a sort of short inundation, like a 1 month or couple of weeks, perhaps 2 months every couple of years. That's what the landscape would have. Then we have a sedgeland, so we'll have sedges that can grow in those typically seasonally inundated areas. So basically every year those areas would dry, and every year they would get wet, but they would not get dry for long enough for the seed bank to change, and the sedges would emerge every year. So that's all emergent vegetation. And we have aquatics, so plants that grow basically in standing water. So as I was showing papyrus earlier, but there can be the whole range of different plants there. And I bet perhaps Richard could tell you more about all this vegetation and the ecosystem functioning there. My knowledge as a hydrologist or climatologist is relatively limited, but let's keep it to that. So what is important in another important thing, there's many important things about the Okavango Delta. So another important thing in the Okavango is that that we have this sort of long-term variability there. So if you look at this is graph that shows the inflows of the Okavango River to the Okavango Delta, and those spikes. This is our annual flood, and I was showing that there are different floods from year to year. But overall, if we sort of start looking at here, this is an annual total. So instead of monthly, there's spikes here from month to month. We see just how much water flows there in the year. We have this sort of pattern that we had relatively dry 30s, 40s, relatively wet 70s, relatively dry 1990s, and then going back to sort of wet 2010s. So this sort of long-term pattern, and it's particularly strongly visible in the distal part, in the lower part of the delta. This is on the inflow side, this is on the outflow side. So this is in Maun, downstream from the delta, and we have relatively large flows in the 70s and 80s, and then basically 1990s there was the river stopped flowing for a couple of years, and then recovered in 2010s. And that again, I was talking about those relationships between the hydro period, the inundation and vegetation, but if we have this sort of system where we have this longer term persistence of this wetness or dryness in the region, then in particular location, because that's how it would manifest, that that some for a number of years here in this wetter period, we would have basically flooding stretching to the limit, to the furthest extent of the floodable area. And in those drier periods, we would have it limited only to a certain. And the dynamics of the vegetation, the vegetation that reacts to sort of year to year or a couple of years persistence of hydro period conditions, that vegetation can change totally between the wet and the dry period, and that creates quite a conundrum when we try to think about how would the climate change affect that ecosystem, affect that behavior of the vegetation, because we would think about so that system could dry potentially, but it dries anyway naturally. That is purely natural level of variability. That period there was not caused by climate change. It might have been magnified slightly by climate change, but it wasn't caused by climate change. So that's sort of a natural occurrence, natural flipping from those sequences of wet years to sequences of dry years and back. And vegetation responds to this, ecosystem responds to this, the animals respond to this, fish respond to that, to those, and they don't the system doesn't die from it. It is adjusted to this. It lives with this variability at shorter time scale, at your seasonal pulse, at interannual variability, and also at this multi-decadal type of variability. So the interesting, I've mentioned, I said already that the fact that we had those dry years in the 90s, it's not due to climate change. It might be magnified by climate change, but it's not exclusively due to climate change. So that's an interesting aspect there, because if we look at the sort of level of variability in a particular system, if we looked at this in the 1990s, so we knew all of this, and we knew about the climate change. Yeah, so we would look at this and say, right, it's drying, that system is drying, and we would sort of extend perhaps this drying into future, and we say, right, in 20 years time, that system would be dead, it would be dry, there is no water, because we would consider this to be climate change. It's not. This is this particular behavior, the difference, the flip between this wet years here and dry years here, it's a natural variability, or mostly natural variability, not climate change. So we know that now because it has recovered, the system has recovered, perhaps not fully, but it has. So one has to consider all this and sort of don't. It's not everything gold that glitters. It's not everything climate change when we see a trend. So that's one thing to remember there. And one has to consider other factors that affect variability in a system like this, that are not necessarily just climate change. There is all this sort of pulsing of the dynamics at multi-decadal, at interannual and multi-decadal timescales. So that's what we have to consider there. So there is also another case that I wanted to show you when we see some sort of patterns, but not necessarily that are not necessarily climate change. So I'm illustrating here again the river discharges in 1970s, 80s, and 2010s, 2020s in two locations, here and here. So there are two different systems. The one river comes here. There is another river that comes here, and supplies Lake Ngami, if perhaps you've heard the name. So if one looks at those hydrographs, you can see that hydrograph here, the Kuniere, that amount of water that flowed in the river in Kuniere in the 2020s was much larger than the amount of river in flow in Boro here in Bowen in the same period. And in the past they were similar. So again, this is nothing that we could attribute to climate change. This is effect of some sort of internal change in distribution of water. So again, not everything gold that glitters. But having said that, that there is no impact of climate change on those particular features of hydrological variability in the delta. There is an impact that we see now. We have done in 2010, 10 years ago, roughly 10 years ago, we've done a study. We've looked at there were those large floods in 2011, 2012 that were out of ordinary. They were sort of basically unprecedented in the recent 30 odd years. There were similar floods earlier in the early 70s, but in the recent years they were unprecedented. And we've looked at those. How do they, whether climate change has influenced them or not? And one can do those sort of analysis running climate models, global climate models, in a way that that allows us to compare what is now and what would have been if we not emitted carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, if we had not increased concentrations. So we've done those analyses, and we can see here the blue line here shows how the floods would look in the world without greenhouse gases, and the red background shows how the flood would look or looked in the world with greenhouse gases. And surprisingly, those floods were not magnified by climate change. There was an impact, but the floods were not magnified by climate change. They were reduced by climate change. So if there was no climate change, if there was no anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, if there was no climate change, we would have a much larger floods than we actually had. They might have been much more destructive than they were in those couple of years there. So that's one of the elements to consider, and that's why we have that is, why we have this sort of direction of an impact. So no increase in flooding, but decrease in flooding is because, there is hardly any signal, there's hardly influence of climate change, anthropogenic climate change on rainfall in the Okavango, both in the delta and in the upstream. And there is a strong influence on temperature. So the temperatures are increasing, evaporation is increasing. And because the evaporation sort of controls the flows in the delta, because it's a large wetland from which the water evaporates, thus, increasing temperature basically reduces flood, reduces inflows into the system, and reduces the floods in the system. So that's the mechanism there. Now, if we look at climate projections, if you look at what we actually predict, how that system would look, how it will behave in the future, we base all those analyses in the so-called IPCC process. IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. That's the large multinational organization that every now and then issues a report that summarizes the state of knowledge of all the scientific community about the climate change, all range of aspects, and some part of that report is devoted to projections of future climate. And we can see in the sort of summary of the projections of future climate, future rainfall and temperatures. These are temperatures. This is rainfall over African continent into the future. And this is shown here as a function of global warming levels. So perhaps you have heard about Paris Agreement that we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So that's like a mean temperature all around the globe. The change in that mean temperature should not be larger than 1.5 degrees. So if we did that, this is what sort of changes we would have. We would have basically a wetter Sahara here, and the drier Southern Africa in general. And we would have a change in temperature in order of here around 1.5 to 2 degrees locally, because that change at 1.5 degrees is the global mean change. Here we would have around 2.5 degrees change in Southern Africa. And then if we warm the globe to larger temperatures, then obviously the local impacts will be much stronger. And the tricky part with the sort of forecasting, or no, it's not forecasting, it's projecting future climate in the Okavango region is that if we look where the Okavango is located here. The delta is located here in the central part of Southern Africa, but the river comes up to the central part of Angola, and basically the northern part of the catchment is located where there is the transition zone between drying, projected drying, and projected little change or wetting. So that sort of creates quite a lot of confusion in different studies because it depends, how do we analyze those particular data sets? How do we analyze those particular projections? We do those projections with a number of models, and not all models are similar. So that's a lot of uncertainty there around how that future climate would look like. So very quickly, if we look at those projections for the Okavango, this is what we would have. So this is from one of our papers. We look at the northern part, central, and the delta here, and here we have sort of trajectories of future rainfall. And I don't show temperature here; I show potential evapotranspiration. So the consequence of temperature on the water. And what is shown here is all those individual gray lines. These are individual models that are used for projecting future climate. And there is many of those models. Thus, there is many different lines. And the problem is that that we can't select a single line. We have to live with this uncertainty when we do climate projections. So there is always this sort of spread of possibilities And here in general, that's what we see, that there is relatively little change on average, but individual models can show much larger rainfall or much smaller rainfall, both in the upper part and in the lower part. There is, though, a relatively consistent increase in potential evapotranspiration, which is underlined by a strong increase in temperature. So that's what our projections are. And now, this was old work. I have a bit newer work here. We have again sort of similar thing. I don't show here in those individual models, just the summary, so sort of the plume of all the models, and that's what we have. That basically, in terms of rainfall, we have projections, the future, that sort of can't decide whether it's going to be wetter or drier. Slightly drier. The tendency of the average or median model is on the drier side there. But in general, there is relatively little coherence between little how to say it, certainty around the direction of change. So it can be both wetter and drier, with sort of tendency towards drier. Now, if we translate that into river flows, that's what we have. So basically, because again, I've mentioned that there is the temperature is increasing, transpiration is decreasing, so the river flows basically reduce. We don't have this sort of spread of up and down and up and down. We have this is inflow to the Okavango at the Mohembo side. It really sort of gets drier, and this is the outflow on the distal part, so the river that comes out. It really gets really much drier. So at the end, in the next 20, 30 years, we'll still have occasionally some floods, but in principle, the flows there will be very low. Now, how do we evaluate ecological impacts of this hydrological change? As I said, that there is a problem. We have a problem with this because there is quite a lot of natural variability, and that the timescales that are comparable with the timescales of climate change, the decadal scale type of variations. So, if we say, how will Delta look in the next 10 years, we would say, right, we could look differently than in the previous 10 years. But, to what extent it is caused by climate change, or to what extent it will be caused by variability. So that's a very tricky thing to do. And there is a couple of approaches that we've developed to look at this. One of them is to sort of translate, sort of look at the time series of hydro ecological units, so sort of how they are distributed and where they are located, and what is their area. Look at the time series of those, and track it based on duration and frequency of inundation. So it's basically hydro period. And this is how the impacts would look like. This is how, what we would see under climate change. So the black line there, the thick black line, is a historical variability. We're looking at 30 odd years. And we look at the area of grassland here, for example. And the gray area is this is the area that shows what would be there in the future, in the 2050, 2080, how that variability would look like. So there is still, we assume that there is still sort of year-to-year variability, decade-to-decade variability. But in general, we see that, that the grasslands, those most productive part of the system would be lower in area. So they would still vary, move from place to place, spread and shrink, but in principle, it will be lower than what we had in the past. The same thing with aquatic communities. So our permanent swamp, again, we have a sort of shrinking of the permanent swamp. It never sort of gets, that in the wettest periods, it would be larger than, that aquatic area covered by aquatics would be larger than in the driest periods in the past. But it's, it never sort of gets to that level, of a sort of overall wetness that we had with the span of the years in the future, compared to what was there in the past. The same with the sedgelands. So those two, grasslands and sedgelands, these are like the most productive, ecologically productive ecological units in the delta. The aquatic communities, the permanent swamp is not particularly productive. Nothing eats papyrus, basically. No, not that many animals eat papyrus. So that's how one could look at this. And savanna, it's what we have in ample supply outside of the delta. So we basically, as a result of climate change, what we will see an increased amount of savanna. So basically, the outer edge of the outer periphery of the delta will turn into sort of permanent savanna. It would never, they would never get inundated. They would never sort of turn into sort of move from the savanna ecosystem type to a grassland type. So that's what we have there. There are different approaches, a bit more sophisticated, that we are working on. Actually, we've never actually done analysis of what we will see in terms of this sort of movement of those different zones in the delta based on this different set of data and models. Perhaps one day we'll do it. But apart from that approach that I was presenting to you, there is also a couple of studies. They are not published, unfortunately. So there are sort of consulting studies that were done for World Bank and Okacom and FAO under funding from FAO or World Bank, and they were based on so-called drift or environmental flows methodology that was developed by Professor King from actually UCT and UWC. Now, and those approaches are there. I'm not entirely sure what sort of messages emerge from them, because I find them relatively awkward, because it's as I said, in the sort of dynamics of the entire system, the problem with assessing ecological impacts is that I don't think that one should look at a particular location, but one should look at a point in space, at a river ridge or at a particular floodplain, and try to evaluate how that floodplain will be changed, because that floodplain changes by itself naturally under natural variability. It was changing in the past, and it could be basically under natural forcing. It can flip between savanna and perhaps not permanent swamp, but savanna and your sedgeland, and it can be in the same place. You can have in one decade you can have a sedgeland. In the next 2 or 3 decades later you can have a savanna. So that's not. That's how do we evaluate that? How do we evaluate the impact of climate change on this particular location? So that's a tricky thing, and that whole methodology is based on individual points and changes in individual points. But it's much more comprehensive than what we've looked at, because we just looked at sort of very high level manifestations of an ecological functioning, which is those hydroecological zones. And those approaches look at a much more nuanced, they look at occurrence of individual fish species and individual plants, and also social economic impacts and so on, and geological impact and so on. So perhaps they are much more comprehensive there. So if you are interested, you can try to look up those studies. So the outcomes from that, one of those studies was, for example, like this, that that they looked at sort of low climate change impacts of our 1.5 degrees type of warming, and medium, which will be 2.5 degrees warming, and then you can have a sort of classification according to level of ecosystem integrity in different parts of that system. Under no climate change, the dry trajectory of the climate change, and wet trajectory of the climate of a changing climate, and basically I think the starting point there the natural conditions, that entire ecosystem is basically under category B, which is one level from the most pristine and most little impacted. And then we have, impacts that can go all the way to basically degraded environment if under sort of stronger climate change in the drier scenario. So that's the impact. Another study that I came across that was looking at climate change back in Okavango was one by Milsov. That was basically pretty similar to what we've been doing. The only thing is that they linked so they looked at changes in different categories of land cover, grassland, shrubland, and so on, under different type of projections. And the only difference was between this and our approaches was that these ones are developed or linked to groundwater depth rather than hydroperiod on the surface. So that's just a different way of looking at things. So now to sum up all these things and to bring in some caveats, that, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm sorry, perhaps the title was title of the talk was bringing too much expectations. I'm not an ecologist, so I can't really talk about really ecological impacts on the system, about particularly about the impacts of increased temperature and increased carbon dioxide on things like plant physiology and how individual species react to those in the system. But I think in the Okavango that might be of perhaps a lesser importance than this transformation of that hydroecological system. And that's what I hope my talk, my presentation addresses and shows. That there are going to be impacts. I haven't come across in any literature about the interpretation of what this means really to say regional wildlife ecology. That would be an interesting thing to do. I'm as I said, I'm not aware about any of the sort of analysis, what the change in areas and change in distribution and location of those different hydroecological units, what implications does it have to how the wildlife migrates, how the wildlife interacts with humans, how that sort of relationship between what's happening in Okavango and in Kaza and in general in the region, how is it going to change? And I don't think, as I mentioned, I haven't come across any of those studies, and also I haven't come across any studies that would look at, say, migratory birds, for example, which might be that whole process might be impacted too. In general, yes. In general, I think there is a what I was trying to illustrate, that the delta is so specific a system, so specific an ecosystem, that it requires a particular approach to evaluate impacts of climate change on the functioning of that entire ecosystem. Because, as I said, you can't really look at the locations; you have to look at the entire system, because the assumption there is the fact that sort of those individual locations sort of move all around the place all the time. And I don't think that we at this stage we really have, as a scientists, we have tools and methodologies and approaches that would allow us to confidently evaluate and assess it, those impacts in a meaningful way in a system like this. So perhaps we still have to work on it. But in general, to sum up, you know, that if you look at those differences in general, you know, in general, like highest level message is that, you know, what we expect from the future under climate change in the Delta is that it's going to be drier. That it's going to have less flooding. That, you know, basically the distal part will turn into savanna. Perhaps not a very large part, but, you know, the parts that the domination of savanna and the shrinking of the entire system with the shrinking of the permanent swamp and all the seasonal floodplains. That's what we will see in the future. So yeah, that was a little bit chaotic. I hope you got some messages out of it. If there are any questions, I hope that I'll be able to answer them now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wolski. I found that talk was fascinating. I also think that for somebody that now majors on the other side, only in biology, you know, to get robust data and what can be drawn from that, that's astounding. I mean, we could look at the future, we could look using the past information. So I think we learned a lot today. So thank you very much, Dr. Wolski, again. Are there any questions? And in that same breath, Dr. Wolski, do you have any questions for the audience? So if you can just raise your hand. Dr. Mazibedi.
Okay, there's a question from my co-lecturer. You may come forward to.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for the very interesting talk, Piotr. Is that how
Yes,
it is?
that's good.
Okay. No, I know you from Ori, but you probably don't know me, but that's okay. My question is, you gave us this nice presentation, and from the presentation, it shows that there is too much natural variability in the flood levels. And all we can say is that, okay, we can make projections. So in the meantime, can we safely say that climate change does not really impact the Delta, or there is negligible impact currently? Can we safely say that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this question. As I was showing, I think, you know, there is an impact on the system as we look at it now. You know, that study that we've done 10 years ago, it was relatively clear in the fact that, you know, that increase in temperature, as little as we have it now, this sort of in order of 0.81 degree in the region, has an impact on the flooding and on consequently on the distribution of all those units, location of them and size. Even now, it's only going to be stronger in the future. You see, the problem there is like this, that, you know, it's very difficult to appreciate that impact right now because it is small compared to the level of natural variability, particularly in this sort of context of this decadal scale variability. You see, so we don't really see it in any way. And, you know, it would be worthwhile looking, for example, the 2019 was one of the lowest floods that Delta experienced. And it would be worthwhile to repeat that study and say, you know, how much lower that flood was than now compared to what would have been without the climate change. But still, you know, it's a mind-boggling situation, you know, because, okay, so what that flood was small. If you know, this year's flood is decent, it's big, it's large. You know, so we have a revival of all those floodplains. They are still active. You know, there is no sort of lasting impact of that particular drier year. You see, so that's when this is what I was trying to say, that 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 concept we have no really, as a scientist, a hydrologist, a ecologist, how do we really capture those impacts? They are there, but how do we, they are there in sort of formal way. Are they there in a way that has some sort of lasting consequences to the broader ecosystem? That's the question that is very difficult to answer there.
That's it.
Okay. I have a question, but first I want to appreciate this opportunity that as Bell 410 we have to interact with Piotr. He's an expert who worked in the Okavango for a long time. He grew old there. So, so I mean, this opportunity is really valuable.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the Okavango Delta is quite heterogeneous. It's variable, and it's one good example to demonstrate the concepts of variability and change. So we are happy to have this lecture. But my question is, what proxies do you use in your modeling? What proxies do you use for these models?
Okay, so you see, basically, the idea there is like this: that we have like, in terms of sort of translating climate impacts on the ecological impacts. So we have, as I was trying to illustrate, those two models that we had, that are basically empirical models, or the one is an expert system, the other one, so its expert system is based on observations, basically based on satellite images, on analysis of satellite images, that you can get from satellite images. You can say, right, this is the distribution of the flood, and this is the distribution of my permanent swamp of vegetation, and this is the distribution of my sedgeland. And then you can sort of develop the relationship between those. Yeah. So that's one sort of. So we basically use a inundation that is the easiest thing to map as a proxy for vegetation. And as I said, in one of those models we used basically remote sensing to get this. In another model that we haven't applied really at this stage, but it has been published, and we want to use it to do this sort of analysis. There again, the inundation is the proxy, but the relationship to so sort of ecosystem nature is based on the relationship between the species distribution and hydroperiod. So, we don't model directly the species distribution there. We model hydrology and hydroperiod, and we use that as a proxy for species distribution, because we have that relationship established based on observations, based on measurements in the field, based on measurements of what species do you see in what floodplains in different parts of the system, and what is the history of inundation in those floodplains. So that's why that my talk was focused on the hydrology, because the hydrology drives everything in the system. That's the main proxy, that inundation duration and frequency that you can recover from, that you can get from a bunch of models. It tells us about how that system changes and how that system looks at a particular moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wolski. Thank you, Dr. Mazivedi. As much as I want this talk to go on, I see we're running out of time.
One more question.
Okay.
From external person, there is Cheryl that has her hand up.
Okay, I think Cheryl, if we can keep it to 2 minutes. Also, welcome, Cheryl. I didn't see,
Hey,
you
Alicia,
there.
you know I can never keep anything short. But what I first of all want to do is thank our guest speaker for this amazing talk. That's the first thing. And the second thing is I would like to thank 30 odd students from TUT that also attended this talk, and I'm sure they have benefited greatly. But just one, I know it's going to be a very broad question, and I don't know whether we all have the answers or whether we have the answers yet, is what can we do now? Or is it too late? I know it's irreversible, but what can we do now?
You mean in general?
In general, yes.
In general, it's, you know, I mean, I was talking about this 1.5 degrees, and 1.5 degrees is sort of an established limit of acceptable change. I think that we can live through. You know, if it gets any stronger than that, I mean, if it gets to the level of sort of 4 degrees global warming, we basically have to change our lives considerably. And you know, it will be a small proportion of us who will change our lives, because all the other parts of us will unfortunately perish. So, you know, I think I'm as a scientist, as a person, I'm very pessimistic. I can hardly see the way that the current society, current, you know, economic system that we have can transform into becoming more climate friendly, and to keep the climate below 1.5. I think that, you know, that there is a consensus at this moment that 1.5 degrees is not realistic anymore. I think we just have to think about our future, really, as individuals, about our parents, I mean, our children, about our grandchildren, and think open-mindedly about you know, what sort of life do we live in, and read as much as we can about, you know, what and be critical about you know, what can be done, what should be done, how do we have to transform not just our individual lives, but, you know, our socio-economic system, our political system. We can possibly vote people into power who will be more sort of conscious, more aware, and more driving us in the direction where we could change these things. But we have to do it together. No, it's not a matter of individual. I mean, it is a matter of individual choices, but, you know, an individual is not going to change anything. We as a global community of individuals have to change in the same direction for that change to occur.
No, I completely agree, Dr. Wolski. I think that you, a scientist, and you assess the problem, and now we need to take practical steps to apply that knowledge for the future. Thank you very
Sure.
much.
All right,
With
thank you very much.
I unfortunately have to end, but what I think, Mariette will share details, or you can contact us to get hold of Dr. Wolski, because there are still some questions in the chat as well. So we'll still be in contact with you, Dr. Wolski, regarding this talk. We just have to unfortunately cut
No
it
problem.
short.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.